Marketing isn't linear anymore. It's a process of, okay, now I need to continue to drive new people in, but then figure out how to keep these customers of mine engaged and excited and when to make an offer to them. And all of a sudden it doesn't become a paint by numbers process, and it becomes a process where you're iterating on it and figuring out what works best for you, and really thinking heavily about what kind of offers you should be making and when you should be making them. And yeah, that can be really overwhelming.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Entrepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 232, and we're going to be talking all about post-launch planning and how to make the most of your post-launch. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is your awesome co-host, Mr. Ed Isola. Ed, I have a question for you today, my friend. Have you ever found yourself in a position where you just finished a launch? Maybe it was a record release or an EP, or even just like a product launch. You know, you dropped new merch or a new merch line, and then you scratched your head when it was all done and said like, okay, well, like what the heck do I do next? I have these customers maybe for the very first time, but I don't know what to do now.
Yes, many times, believe it or not. But no, we thought this episode would be pretty cool today because I think that that's one of the main hurdles, I guess you would say, or unexpected, blockers that people that are working on the buddy system run into. And I know it was one that I definitely was not expecting initially, but as what I believe is like pretty straightforward when you come into Indiepreneur, IndieX, IndiePro, and you're learning about the fact it's like, okay, here's the buddy system. Here's my fan finder. Here's the top of funnel. Here's my email list. Here's my permission offer. That feels very step-by-step process, or at least it did for me when I first
linear.
Yeah, it's very linear. When I first met Cirque and Jack, and where I was learning all this stuff and implementing it, it was like, okay, I get it. Here's the first step. Here's the second step. Here's the third step. Here's the fourth step. And obviously you ask questions and learn those things, but it was very linear, and where it just kind of diverted into just, in my mind, total pandemonium and confusion was like, well, I made a sales offer. Now, all of a sudden, I went from this linear process to now I have a customer, and now I also have somebody else coming into the funnel. And so you start to get people at multiple touch points. It could be very complicated, and I felt like it was very complicated to me. And I also felt like I wasted a lot of time after we first made customers because I didn't know what to do. And so my hope was, whether you're just doing your first offer to customers, or you're on your second or third album and you're making consistent offers to customers, there are some techniques and some things there that are really beneficial, and also in between really beneficial, to make sure that you're not just crushing it on steps 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. You make a customer, and then so be it, like Godspeed to them, so to speak, a
really good point you raised that I think is really important and kind of worth stressing here is like, I think this is the point where a lot of artists realize and bands realize that, like, as much as we can play out funnels in our marketing, as much as we can orchestrate, top of funnel to middle of funnel with opt-ins and getting people on your list or getting people to sign up for text and making offers, this is the point where it stops. It can stop and does stop becoming so linear. Marketing isn't linear anymore. It's a process of, okay, now I need to continue to drive new people in, but then figure out how to keep these customers of mine engaged and excited and when to make an offer to them. And all of a sudden it doesn't become a paint by numbers process, and it becomes a process where you're iterating on it and figuring out what works best for you, and really thinking heavily about what kind of offers you should be making and when you should be making them. And yeah, that can be really overwhelming.
I remember thinking this when it first happened for me, was like, this felt like the portion of the test, so to speak, where it was no longer open book. And now it was just like, you got to actually show that you know what you're doing at this point. You know what I mean? I don't say that in an intimidating way, but it went from like, here's the paint by number steps you take to get to this point. And then once you're there, it's like, here's this, lawless land where you're working, and you got to make sure you're kind of talking to people and being consistent about it. So my hope is to kind of for as much as some of this will be open-ended or broad in the sense of I can't tell you exactly what emails to send, my hope is to kind of outline this process that I've used and a lot of other clients use to make sure that you're not letting people go cold. You're not just getting a list of 10 or 50 or 100 or 500 customers and then never engaging with them again. So there's really like, in my mind, there's like maybe 3 things that I would recommend. One is get a let me I should make sure I remember these too because I'm going off the top of my head. But there's 3 things that I recommend is like you get into this area, what do I do now with these people that are customers? And the first one is make sure you keep emailing them. They'll go through whatever your opt-in is, they'll buy something, that's great. I would keep emailing them once a week or once every 2 weeks. So like 2 to 4 emails a month. And obviously you want to make sure you have content, but the best place to draw that content from is whatever you're doing musically. And your emails don't have to be big tour announcements or single announcements or album announcements, but you want to just keep people in the loop and talk to them. And I think what's really kind of important here to stress is like when you first get somebody on your list and you're trying to make them a customer, you're driving very, very directly towards listen to my music, buy my music. When you close that process up, especially if you're doing an album launch, I found that I didn't have music to talk about that they hadn't heard yet, so I didn't know what to do. What I should have really been doing is saying, what am I doing musically for this week? Let me put that in an email and just highlight a couple things for people and be like, man, this week I worked on a new song. It went great. It didn't go great. Blah, blah, blah. Like, feels like it's exciting to be working on new music already.
That's a big mindset shift, I think, for a lot of artists who think that the communications that they put out there, I mean, we see this on social all the time. And I honestly think that the music industry has programmed artists to think this way, that everything needs to be big, right? Like, oh, I'm going to go ghost the day before I drop something. Like, I'm going to not post. How many times do we see artists go dark? Like, in my opinion, one of the worst things that you can do. But the point that I'm getting at here is like, it's a definite shift in thinking to go from like my posts and my emails need to be about big events to what you're talking about. It's like my emails that I'm sending to my customers to give them value after they've, had a transaction with me. I need to make sure that I'm kind of topping off the goodwill vault, so to speak. I'm filling it back up. I need to make sure that I'm giving them something. And those can be micro moments. They don't have to be big tentpole events every week. No wonder people think that marketing is unsustainable when they're programmed to think that way.
Yes, that's a very good clarification of what I was kind of trying to say. Was like naturally you will have albums and you'll have release cycles, and that's a thing in music, right? You'll have that always, but don't think of your fan interactions as cyclical. That should just be consistent. And so that to me was the mindset shift of like, I'm always going to be talking to people. I'm always going to be emailing people. I'm always going to be letting them know what I'm doing. Sometimes that's going to be something really big or cool. Sometimes that's going to be something as mundane as like I said, hey, I worked on a new song today. I feel like I got a really good chorus, but I couldn't get much else. But like, it feels exciting to be working on new music. You don't want to complain to your subscribers. You just want to be transparent about, here's how I'm feeling. Here's how I'm doing. You don't need to tell them, hey, I had a turkey sandwich for lunch. But if you keep it music specific, and you're always having this consistent conversation with them, that was a big, big mindset shift for me that went from, it took me a year and a half to realize that too. It's like people just want to hear from you. And that's something you probably hear us say a lot.
Dude, I love the way that you said like your communication with your fans and especially your customers here, like kind of keeping in the spirit of this episode where we're talking about like post-launch. It can't be cyclical. Like the next time they hear from you should not be when you're dropping something else. Imagine if you talk to your friends and family only when you were having a birthday party, right? Like
only when you need something from your mom do you call, like that's like,
yeah.
Or your siblings or your friends or whatever. It's like, hey, I need you to now give me money. It's like, okay, you're very quickly going to get this reputation that you're like leeching off of people.
Yeah, exactly. You'll very quickly be the band or the artist that's always kind of tapping someone on the shoulder for favors and not giving value. And you give value in more ways than you think. Like I think when I say things like that, it could scare artists who are like, man, I'm already putting my heart and soul into this music. Like, isn't that enough? I hear that so often. Like, isn't what we do enough? I get it. I really do. And I'm not trying to be a hard ass here. But like, oftentimes, what you're doing, oftentimes artists don't portray what they're doing well enough to their fans so that they perceive it as valuable. And perception is so important here. And that's why sharing those micro stories, those mini moments, the things that are happening related to your music on a regular frequency, like Ed was saying, that's why that's so important.
Yeah, that's really, really a really good point. It's like you are working really hard on it. Nobody knows how hard.
Yes.
It's like, if you ever grew up playing sports, it was always like, you're going to do great in the game, essentially, if you practice really hard when nobody's watching. This is the opposite. And that was also a rewire for me, is like, you don't want to be grinding behind closed doors. You want to be working hard and enjoying it, but you need to open up those doors and let people see what's going on. Otherwise, to them, as an outsider looking in, all they see is like, album came out in October of 2022 and next album came out in October of 2024, and they didn't know anything else between then was going on the email list, so to speak, maybe products. But so that's where I just view this thing as like, I have this calendar and I'm like, I need to send an email on these 4 days this month. What can I slot in here? Is there something cool? Is there something not? But that's, I think, to your point too, Jack, is like, there's different kinds of value that you can provide. And especially to these customers, it's like, they just bought something. They just got music from you. So you need to switch from saying, hey, let me give you free songs and let me give you a discount on this product or this really cool bundle that you can buy, to let me give you some value via attention. And that actually segues really well into what like number two is if number one is someone becomes a customer, make sure you're sending them emails. Make sure you're opening up conversations with them. Point number two here to remember is like, if they respond back to them, like actually have these conversations as much as you can. And there's very few artists that I know that receive so many emails that they can't respond to them. I mean, like some of the people we work with at IndieX receive thousands of emails back when they send something out. And that's crazy because they're massive. But like even the 502s, we send an email out. It's like, yeah, we'll get 75 to 100 responses from something. But it takes, 2 hours to respond over the course of a couple of days, we still hit everybody back via email, because it's like, there's just that extra touch of, hey, you bought something cool. I emailed you about something totally unrelated to that, and you hit me back, and I just take the time to respond and say, this is so awesome, thanks. It doesn't have to be a paragraph. Like, there's that psychological, like, wow, these people are actually talking to me. They actually care. And that's the thing with customers where 1 and 2 in my mind tie together really well, is that if you're looking at it from like a whole timeline of they just became a customer, right? And then you're emailing them, you're keeping in touch with them, you're responding when they hit you back via email, you're being transparent. Next, when it comes time to make your next sales offer, in a month or 2 months or 6 months, whenever it is, hopefully not 6 months, that's a long way away. But when it becomes time to make your next sales offer, that becomes way less weird, in the sense of, you can be like, hey, I just made this cool product. Here it is if you want to grab it. And you can drop this thing. And also, as you're brainstorming about this, you can slot it in and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing a shirt. I'm thinking about doing this. And that's where that consistent open line of communication, those two things tie together. Both send emails, but when they respond, make sure you respond back to them until the conversation kind of reaches the natural conclusion.
A lot of what you just covered there plays really nicely into the topic that we talked about a few weeks ago, which was like amplifying your customer experience. I'll make sure we link to that in the show notes so that you guys can revisit it in case you haven't heard it or you didn't let the ideas really sink in. But a lot of what we talked about there was like, be communicative, have conversations. And that was often related to just supporting the sale, making sure that the fulfillment of that promise that you made, of the order that someone made, was going to be fulfilled. But it rings true when it comes to continuing to nurture this relationship and make sure that the fan feels like they're cared about and that they're in your world, and that, you didn't just, it wasn't just a transactional one-time relationship. So much of that, I think, carries over into exactly what we're talking about here, which is really like nurturing as the core.
It really is, and it really does carry over. And I know this probably, if you're listening, you might be like, well, duh, I'm going to respond to people and I'm going to email them about what's going on. But I don't think that the things that we're saying right now are as easily seen when you're in the weeds, so to speak. Like if you're head down trying to generate customers, it's not easy to then pick your head up and immediately realize, oh, I should have a recurrent email strategy and hit these people back. So I'm hoping that this kind of outlines like the step after creating a customer is to create a recurring email strategy and be transparent and talk to them and respond when they come back. Like that's the next step. And that's the public facing step as you plan, your next offer or your next album, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so well said. And I think it supports kind of what we're going to talk about next, which is like how you take these people up to the next step, how you plan your next sales promotion, what you look for, the nurturing these conversations, all of that supports having something to do with these people next. I think that it's critical. Otherwise, you're just going to have a fan base that, like you said, Ed, goes cold.
Yeah. And like Jack said, that's number 3, right? Like I said at the start, there's 3 things. It's like open conversations, respond to conversations, and actually engage. And then number 3 is as you're doing that, and it's like I said, it's this, I guess, icing, might be a good way or a metaphor to describe it. Like these nurturing conversations, that's the icing on top. And while you're doing that, you're kind of like, maybe that's not the best explanation. Maybe it's like a house, right? Where you build the framework and the framework's standing and that's still standing while you're building the rest of the house and kind of fleshing the house out. That's how I view this, where steps 1 and 2 are like, hey, you're talking to people like this is going on while in the background you're planning. And that's number 3 is like, make sure you're planning something that's coming up, because you don't want to just get known as the group that never provides anything for people to support you, because that's another form of nurturing, that people are nurtured when they buy from you. And obviously you make money, but it's like, you can't just always give free stuff, right? You want to provide a lot of free stuff, way more than you have them pay for, but you also have to create this buy-in of like, hey, I've been talking to Eddie and, going back and forth for a month and a half, 2 months. It'd be cool just to actually support them. I like the 502s. It'd be cool to support them. And so you have to slot that in, and you have to be planning, well, what's my next sales promo? What's my next opportunity that I'm going to give people to say, hey, if you support us, here's the thing. You don't have to do a hard sell, but you do have to give them that option to say, all right, cool. Because that's how you create repeat customers in this whole cycle together. 1, 2, and 3 is talk to people, open conversations, demonstrate that you actually care, and then allow them to continue to kind of put their money where their mouth is and support you. And you just create more and more and more positive sentiment around buying, around supporting, around being invested in your project the longer you do that. And it took me, to figure out those 3 steps post our first album launch, took me a year and a half, 2 years to figure out like, hey, here's what we should be doing.
Why do you think that was?
I think it was because I was so hyper-focused on the fact that it was linear, and then it switched from linear into free range, of like, well, now I don't have exact steps to follow. If I'm following setting up an album launch, and that's all I know, and that's my only reference point for marketing at that point, well, I don't know what to do until I need to do another album launch, And the one thing that we did really well was we continued to email people after. And we weren't making offers though, but we were emailing. So we at least kept those lines of communication open. But that's where I feel like you can get tripped up of like, you do this big effort, you make this big kind of like push, and you ship this whole album launch kind of thing. It can feel very natural to take a step back and go dark or to ghost, but that's literally the worst thing you can do, because you're starting off, you're trying to build this relationship with people, and then you just disappear on them. That's not going to build a relationship with people,
No, that really builds like a customer that forgets, honestly, and a fan that forgets. And you don't want that. You don't want people to go cold. Something you and I think both have said on this show, that like, if you're not making offers to your fans, like, it's inherently selfish. that is missing out on a big opportunity to give your fans something valuable that even some subset of them probably want. And if you're not doing that, like that is holding back, that is withholding something from people who want. And I think that that sucks. And you shouldn't do that. To kind of like bookend nurturing on like the back, we're now talking about like ascension planning, right? I think one thing to think about on that side is like, what does your product strategy look like when you're starting to think about like, okay, I'm nurturing these people, I'll gear up for a second sale. You might look at, for example, and this is just like a quick and easy recommendation to make, like you can do this in 15 minutes or 20 minutes, is look at your customer list, look at your, you know, your back end and your CRM, and look to see like, of my first time customers, what did they all buy, or what buying patterns, offers do they have in common? Is there one thing that people were being driven to? For example, that might be, you know, a bundle that was part of your album launch, or it might be your vinyl, or it might be a CD, or it might be a specific shirt. You want to see like, what did all these people buy? Because you don't want to offer it to them again. So you don't want to plan your next offer around something that these people already have. You want to try to figure out, it sounds basic, but like it's really easily overlooked. You want to make sure to go with what the next thing logically should be. And maybe the things are related, you know, like they very well could be tied in together somehow, either through like the theme of the product, or, you know, if they picked up a CD, the next thing you might want to offer them is another CD. I know that sounds crazy and really, really simple, but there's some truth to that. That's kind of point number one that I wanted to make about like product strategy when it comes to Ascension. And then on the other bookend, when I was thinking about this episode and like talking about post-launch planning, is like on the other side, you're going to have people that didn't buy, right? You're going to have new fans that are coming into your world that are not customers. So we're talking about what to do with your customers in a post-launch period. But really, one other thing that you can't neglect is like, try to get more of them.
Yeah. I just wrote that note down too. I was like, that was the other thing I didn't think about. I thought, as probably a lot of people do, very self-conscious about, well, I made the offer for the CD. If they didn't want it, I don't need to ever offer this thing to them again. And then I think the first offer we made after a long time of not making an offer was two people that hadn't bought the CD the first time around with a cooler offer. It was like, hey, you know, free plus shipping and handling with an order bump, or like some kind of bonus item. I can't remember exactly what it was, but we went back and we made the offer again down the road for the same exact product they didn't want the first time with a different angle on it. What would you know? Another 100 people bought the thing or whatever it was. And it's like,
yeah, exactly.
That's a really good point on planning the offers. Like, don't be self-conscious about what you're offering people. Just offer stuff to people. And you want to be strategic about it. You don't want to offer somebody a CD they already bought, but that's where, you know, the episode from last week where we're talking about integrating like Drip and Shopify or your autoresponder and your store work together really well, because you can have that kind of capability. You can segment people out and you can make them specific offers. And that's where it gets really cool, because if you're making specific offers to people based off what they have and have not bought already, it flows in with this whole idea of like, be authentic with people. And it's really natural to be keeping people in the loop about what you're doing, and then be like, hey, by the way, I know you haven't bought this CD, but Christmas is coming. Thought it might be cool if you got it for free and give them a free plus shipping and handling or whatever. But you can tailor the language in your offers to people so it feels very natural.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like a concept in marketing, we talk about like how aware a prospect is, right? Or a potential customer, how aware a fan is of what it is that you're offering. And, now you've got your batch of customers over here that are very aware. They bought, they're now customers, but you have pockets of fans that some of them may be unaware that you even made an offer 3 months ago or last month, because they're just coming into the fold for the first time, or they're unaware of what that offer really entailed. You've got other people who were aware of it and they just weren't ready to take action. And then you've got people who, they just need a deal. So yeah, like you were saying, Ed, like it might come down to like someone didn't buy when you launched your record or when you dropped your merch, but when Black Friday comes around, they're looking out for your deal. they're looking out for how you're bundling things together or how you're reframing the offer to be different. So yeah, you shouldn't neglect opportunities to continue to make more customers in your post-launch period. I think that that's a mistake that a lot of artists make, and it's why artists get in kind of these roller coaster revenue patterns where between launches they don't have anything really going on revenue wise except for streaming and touring. Maybe they get a trickle of e-commerce activity, but we see this all the time at the agency. And it's really one of the big problems that we look to correct. Honestly, it's one of the big kind of like marketing challenges that we're like, oh, this is something that we can really help people with.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the last thing too that I kind of am viewing this is like I look at this now as nurturing, communicating, planning your offer, right? Like those are the three steps. And I think that if you're listening to this, we're looking at this specifically from an angle of you just made a customer. What do I do next? I think that whole nurturing, communicating, planning your offer / next move, that can be applied to any time that you're in a down period. And if you've been doing it long enough, it's like you have peaks and valleys. You're never at 100% all the time, right? If you're planning an album launch, that's probably going to be a peak and then you're going to dip. If you're doing a free plus shipping and handling funnel and it's going great for 3 months, it's probably going to dip at some point. If you're putting music out and you're really, really active, or you're touring, you're really, really active, like that's a peak. You come home, that's a valley. And the way I think about this is that you're going to have those peaks and valleys, but where you peak, using this idea of like the 3-step nurturing of like email, communicate, plan your next move, those first 2 steps in my mind are now aimed at, all right, we peaked. Let's maintain as much of that peak as we possibly can. It will come down a little bit, but if we can say go from 0 to 10, and then by nurturing people, we retain 80% of those people, and now we're at 8, like next time we peak, we'll be going from 8 to 20, or that kind of thing. And so that's where it gradually builds. And that's where it's this long-term vision of the buddy system that has worked really, really well for me and for a lot of clients at IndieX that give it the time to work. It's like you're taking these iterative steps. And then the quicker you grasp this idea we're talking about around like, offer, nurture, offer, nurture, offer. When you become really, really good at this process and you understand like these 3 steps, that's where you can start to expedite your growth, right? There's going to be a natural learning curve of let me do this the first time, then let me do it a little quicker the second time. But I feel like now, like at the agency, we're at a place where people come on, and as the IndieX team, we grasp this really well. And we're like, all right, well, here's the next steps, right? We're planning ahead. And then that's where you just start creating more customers more quickly. You're grabbing more subscribers more quickly. You're doing things a little more complicated. But it's really important to, one, grasp this and understand that this is the next step. This is the patchwork. You can go into like referral and that kind of stuff, but this is really like the streamlined version of the most immediate way to get nurturing and ascension baked into your system. My last point is this is a really good opportunity for, if you're listening to this and you don't have customers yet and you're just planning now and you have some fans, be it social media or email, you can nurture those people. You can nurture them and communicate with them as you plan your next step. So it applies to any stage where you're at, of just like as you're planning, make sure you're nurturing, is essentially the punchline of this episode.
I think that's a really good point. It's about making this a part of your process ongoing and systematizing it and kind of ingraining it, really. Like if you've got multiple band members that you're working with, like see who can play a part in this. If you're just working with yourself, figure out exactly the framework that you want to use. What kind of emails are you going to be sending? How are you going to be fielding the conversations? Set aside, like, as crazy as this sounds, like set aside a time for yourself where it's like, okay, I know on Wednesdays at 7:30, I'm going to go through emails and make sure that I respond to customer emails. On Thursday afternoons after work, I'm going to shore up my offer strategy and start moving towards making my next offer. And, I'm going to set a date for when I know I want that to happen and who I'm going to be making the sales offer to. These are all kind of the ways that I think, like what you were saying, Ed, is like you want to really start. This is a mindset process, I think, shift as much as it is then taking that and putting it into action. Because like we can sit here and talk about these things forever, and if you don't do anything about them, then like you won't be able to expedite that growth. So yeah, this is kind of where, again, things don't feel so linear, maybe a little wibbly wobbly in terms of in terms of the direction that you should be going in. But hopefully this kind of gives you guys a bit of a roadmap in terms of how we think about what's going on post-launch when artists are really trying to figure out, okay, like I did this major thing, I pulled off a stunt, and now I need to, continue the momentum. I also really liked what you had to say about like, if we ramped up from 1 to 10 and got a whole bunch of customers, on the way back down, we want to land with consistency at 7 or 8 and not go back down to 1. And you've seen that even with, I think this applies everywhere. Like this applies even to like your top of funnel growth. Like you guys have seen that with like viral growth, with like your streaming numbers, people discover your music and then they're in your world and they see just how active you guys are. This is the 502s that I'm talking about specifically. And they see how active you guys are and then they stick. And we see that in the numbers on, your Spotify for Artists dashboard, where you can see like pop up, come back down, but we don't level off to where you started,
Yeah, absolutely. And like my mindset now is like when we have a peak, it's like, oh, there's a peak. Let's get as many people as we can. Let's talk to as many people as we can. Let's run as many ads as we can. Let's do as much as we can to keep these people in our ecosystem at all costs. And then naturally, like I would say we're in a valley is not the right word, but we're in a period of time where there's nothing crazy going on. We're doing tours. It's going great. We're nurturing. We're doing sales promos, but like we're seeing success, but there's not a huge peak right now. It's like, here was the peak. It came down a little bit. And now we've really leveled out at a nice level that's consistent. And while we're doing all that stuff, we just launched a vinyl promo that did great. We're running all these ads. We're doing shows. We're doing everything that we want to be doing. But we're also thinking, hey, what's the next step, right? We're talking to people. We're talking to our fans. But we're also thinking about, well, what's the next thing that's going to give us a chance to kind of level up, so to speak? What's that video going to be? What are we doing there? That's how we're kind of approaching it, is saying, all right, everything doesn't have to be constant growth all the time, but when you do experience growth, catch as much of it as you can.
That's really well said. Hopefully this gives you guys a little bit of how we approach post launches, and in particular, just kind of how we approach the customer journey in terms of planning. We talked a few weeks back about like customer experience and support and making sure that people feel taken care of. But this is going a few steps further in terms of how it actually sets your marketing on a path for future success. So I hope you guys dug this episode. I hope that if you've ever felt overwhelmed or confused after a launch, that this gives you some action items to consider and start working towards, whether you're, 2 days post-launch or 2 years post-launch, things that you can be focused on today. I hope you dig into it, and we'll see you guys next time on Creative Juice. Peace out, Indies.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the West Coast, feel me? Say what?